Good evening, class. Tonight we're going to cover the Second Punic War. So I'm going to break it down into who, what, where, when, why, and then kind of go over some of the longer-lasting implications of the war. So first, who? The Second Punic War was fought between the Roman Republic and the Carthaginians. What? The war was fought as a follow-up to the First Punic War, which was primarily a naval contest which saw Carthage's naval supremacy brought to an end. The Romans had sought undisputed control of Sicily, an island which lies directly across the Mediterranean from Carthage, though closer in proximity to Italy. Ending with an enormous debt of reparations from the Carthaginians to the Romans, the Carthaginians redirected their efforts away from Sicily and decided to expand to the northwest to southern Gaul, in what is now Spain. This was due to an unsuccessful revolt in Carthage, known as the Mercenary or Truceless War, and the breach of truce by the Romans, who annexed Corsica and Sardinia while the rebellion was being fought. In the wake of the rebellion, Hamilcar Barca, a Carthaginian general, took his family and the army he led in quelling the rebellion to Iberia. Here, Hamilcar carved out a territory for himself as a vassal state in the sphere of Carthaginian influence. It is under these circumstances that Hamilcar's semi-autonomous state laid siege to Saguntum, a small town by the Ebro River, violating the Ebro Treaty of 226 BC with the Romans, which provided the casus belli necessary for the Romans to declare war on Carthage a second time. When? The war was conducted between 218 and 201 BC. Where? The war was fought in what is now Spain, southern France, Italy, Malta, and North Africa. Why? Rome's expansionistic tendencies came into direct conflict with Carthage's satellite territorial holdings. Despite hundreds of years of treaties dating back to 509 BC, war ultimately became inevitable, according to Polybius, who believed Roman cultural and political superiority necessitated an increase of the Roman sphere of influence in the area. Polybius is one of the main chroniclers, but we'll cover him in a little bit. So what happened? Following the siege of Saguntum, the army of the Barcas, being Hamilcar, Hasdrubal, Mago, and Hannibal, was split into multiple parts. Hamilcar and Hasdrubal maintained operations in Iberia while Hannibal moved toward Italy. He was able to take an inland route while evading Roman forces sent to interrupt his movement. He crossed the Alps with 37 elephants and roughly 36,000 troops. The numbers of soldiers being bolstered by Gallic volunteers as Hannibal sacked Turin and defeated Publius Cornelius Scipio at the river Ticinus. And then a month later, the Roman relief force of Tiberius Sempronius Longus at the Battle of Trebia. Scipio was nearly killed at Ticinius and was saved by his son Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would later be called Africanus. After some time of cat-and-mouse activity, Hannibal inflicted a disastrous blow on the Romans at the Battle of Lake Trasimene, or Trasimene, we call it Lake Trasimene in English generally, where over 20,000 Romans were killed. Hannibal then moved south in Italy to recruit Italic tribes allied to Rome or under their dominion to his cause. In order to raise more troops, the Romans sent Quintus Fabius Maximus, later to be called Cunctator, the delayer, to delay Hannibal, but ultimately the Fabian strategy proved too costly to rich Romans whose lands were constantly being ravaged by the Carthaginians. His policy of avoidance and harassment was effective, but not conducive to decisive victory. At the next consular election, more hawkish consuls were elected who raised the largest Roman army to have ever been assembled to date, consisting of some 86,000 soldiers. Hannibal fought the vastly superior army with a deliberately weak infantry center at the Battle of Cannae, annihilating the Roman army, and followed the victory with another crushing victory by one of his allied Gallic tribes a few weeks later. Essentially, his center collapsed, the infantry fell back, and then the superior infantry in his army came into the sides and enveloped the Romans. Rome's government was then in chaos. Allies defected and enemies declared war. This was the beginning of the Macedonian Wars. In the wake of Cannae, 10 years of war passed between the Romans and the Carthaginians until members of both the Carthaginian Barcid and Roman Scipionist dynasties were killed. In Iberia, the younger Publius Cornelius Scipio came of age and leveled defeats against the Barcas, avenging the defeats and ultimate deaths of his father and his father's brother, or his uncle. In 206 BC, Publius Cornelius Scipio defeated a vast Carthaginian army of over 50,000 men and finalized a tumultuous but lasting Roman control over Iberia. Scipio was then given control of the Sicilian legions and sent to Africa the following year. In the 3 years that came afterwards, he brought about 2 Roman victories through guile and superior generalship, until finally Scipio soundly defeated Hannibal in Wellingtonian fashion at Zama, decisively ending the Second Punic War and leading to a capitulation of Carthage to all of Rome's demands. The results of the war: Carthage was forced to cede all territorial acquisitions, appeal to Roman consent to wage any war, limit their navy to 10 warships, and to pay an indemnity of 10,000 talents over 50 years to Rome. 52 years later, the Third Punic War was fought in response to a breach of the draconian terms imposed by Rome on Carthage in the Second Punic War. And the Third Punic War ended in 146 BC with the complete destruction of Carthage and the total destruction of its population, with 50,000 of the original 150,000-ish people being sold into slavery. What are the lessons we learn? Carthage was the 3,000-year-old inheritor of Mediterranean supremacy from the Phoenicians. Their cultural influence could be felt for thousands of miles in every direction. Rome was comparably an upstart, motivated by cultural motives and a belief in prophecy to be the unrivaled lord of all she touched or could even perceive. Co-opting gods and cultural icons from every culture she encountered, Rome grew in power and influence in 250 years to rival an ancient but friendly competitor. We learn most of what we know about the Second Punic War from Polybius, a Greek chronicler who lived during the Third Punic War, but who interviewed survivors and visited battlefields of the First and Second Punic Wars to construct a reasonably cogent and generally reliable narrative of the wars in his histories. Other ancient historians borrowed heavily from him. Polybius does provide a well-balanced narrative from both Roman and Carthaginian perspectives, while rarely shying away from making valuations of both states' decision-making processes. While ultimately he was apologetic to a seeming sense of destiny by way of cultural and political superiority of the Romans, Polybius does not spare Rome of criticism when Roman politicians acted spitefully or Roman generals acted cowardly or ineptly. The Second Punic War also presents us with the middle of a clash of dynasties which extends through all 3 Punic Wars. Hannibal's grandfather fought on Sicily in the First Punic War. Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus' grandson sacked Carthage. The Punic Wars also served as a moral lesson to Rome's enemies and posterity. One of the most important works of Roman cultural propaganda was written about the fall of Carthage as the end of a lover's quarrel begun in the Trojan War by the poet Virgil. Literary terms such as Carthaginian peace are the linguistic progeny of historical and literary tropes constructed in the wake of the story of bitter enemies and eternal enmities between the heroes and villains played out on the grandest stage on earth at the time. Legends arose about Hannibal vowing absolute and everlasting hatred to the Romans, and also about Scipio Aemilianus weeping as Carthage burned at his behest, seeing the future of Rome in the flames, a victim of her own successes. Hannibal, as later would be Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan or Tamerlane, was the boogeyman of his day. He was the personification of the uncivilized and unworthy of human dignity. People often looked to unchecked patriotic zeal in times of war to make meaningful their banal lives, but Hannibal at the gates is a representation of fear manifest beyond the control of reason. Hannibal had a tremendous gift in the intersections of artistry and scientific application in the act of war, which for 12 years made him the master of the Roman psyche in the Italian peninsula. Hannibal's genius is almost never questioned, just as Scipio's is almost never mentioned. J.F.C. Fuller attributes this to the endearing narrative of history's losers. I attribute it to the lightness of an ancient horror story, where the audience will always remember the given visage or the grim visage of the monster, but always must be reminded of the main protagonist's real name. This week's readings are intended to help you think long and hard on one of the greatest cultural clashes in history. Thank you. So what do we learn from the Second Punic War? we learned that history is not necessarily an indicator of future success. Carthage had been a long enduring empire. Rome had been around for about 250 years. But we see that culture and the aggregation of other cultural benefits, at least in regard to war, can be fruitful boons to help you leverage an enemy's weakness against them. The Romans were able to learn from all of the different combats that Hannibal had brought about to them and defeated them with. Much like Wellington was able to learn from Napoleon, so too did Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus learn from Hannibal. When you're able to see and adequately identify the problems that lead to a defeat, that's how you can start to begin the process of remediating either the weaknesses of your army or in your tactical or operational battle plans. And Scipio Africanus, if you read JFC's Fuller's book on him, he does a good job of kind of picking apart from the perspective of a turn of the 20th century battlefield commander what weaknesses Hannibal had and how Hannibal's passions may have overridden his good sense, whereas Scipio Africanus was nearly never rocked. Much also like Wellington, he was able to think his way clearly through all the problems that he was presented, and he was able to use a fair amount of guile and treachery to help augment the capacity and capability of his forces. So think long and hard on that, and I hope you enjoy the week's readings, and have a great evening. Thank you.